Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of the SKS and AK-47 in China. I'm Jason Clower. This is a course about why the PLA deliberately chose and kept obsolescent weapons, like the Type 56 SKS carbine, and also why they undervalued weapons like the Type 56 AK. Today's episode is part of a mini-series about classic PLA small unit tactics, the way that the PLA evolved and enculturated itself to fight before the advent of the Type 56 family. It's these principles of small unit tactics that form kind of the larger puzzle into which the pieces that formed the Type 56 family fit. The SKS carbine, the Chinese clone of the Type 3 AK-47, and the RPD light machine gun. So we're going to slow down and really enjoy this like a fine meal because classic PLA tactics were so far ahead of their time. If these guys could simply have been publishing in the Small Wars Journal or the Marine Corps Gazette or the Infantry Journal or War on the Rocks, if they could have been publishing this stuff in English or French in the 1950s, they would have been the great pioneers. Although their tactics were unlike those used by communist forces in Vietnam later, in fact, the two ended up being diverging in important ways. Certainly, this Chinese communist Maoist style of warfare that we're describing now formed the basis, the foundation, the template for those Vietnamese evolutions. They formed what you might call sort of like the trunk of the great tree of insurgency that took shape and branched off later in the 20th century. This is where it all begins. I mean, of course, it goes back farther. It has its roots in earlier Chinese warfare. There were influences from other countries, certainly. Much of this early Chinese communist strategic and tactical thought really is explicitly taken from classical Chinese sources like Sun Tzu or the Sanshi Liu Ji, the 36 stratagems. We're going to do that in a more disciplined way later. The plan for today is that I'm going to introduce you to one of the foundational principles of Marshal Lin Biao's classic PLA tactics. Friends, the classic PLA tactical principle that we're talking about today is called 两面一点, which I'm going to translate as two faces, one point. That's a sort of an unconventional translation. I'm going to explain why later. Friends, FYI, in Chinese, this is always said 1 point, 2 faces, 一点两面. For some reason, I kept switching them around. It's neither here nor there, but I just wanted to make a note. And the way I'm going to explain it, the principle of two faces, one point, is going to boil down to splitting or spreading the enemy's attention over two or more areas to misdirect him so that you can strike him in a place and way that's safest for you and worst for him. Now, if you look at a textbook illustration of a two faces, one point attack, you'll see something like this. We have an enemy position with an attack to its front. It also now has a PLA force behind it that's both attacking into the enemy's rear and also serving as security, just in case that enemy position starts getting reinforcements from its rear. And then the idea is that while the enemy is preoccupied with the attack from these two directions, another attack, the real attack, comes in as a sort of pinprick or spearhead from some third unexpected place. That's kind of the ABC Lego building block version. That's one possible way of representing it, and if you look it up in a textbook, that's usually the way you'll see it drawn. And that's great. That's a good paradigmatic example. But what I'm here to underscore is that two faces, one point is a principle. It's not a diagram. It's not a geometrical arrangement. It's not a set piece choreographed play like you might have in basketball or American football, where the coach has the team gather around the whiteboard with a bunch of X's and O's, and he's like, okay, this guy's gonna go this way. Now this guy's gonna go shallow to the left, and the other one's gonna run deep into the end zone and button hook and then catch the pass. It's not like that. It's not that it's a choreographed set piece maneuver. It's a principle, and it can be applied in a bunch of different ways. And so it can end up looking a bunch of different ways. But the continuing thread that conjoins all these possible variations is that in all cases, the PLA is spreading or splitting the enemy's attention to two or more areas as misdirection so that a main attack can be snuck in with as little fanfare as possible in a place and way that is most advantageous to the PLA and most harmful to the enemy. Any attack that fits those conditions can be called a two-face, one-point attack. And in fact, there could be three faces and one point. There could be four. There could be two faces and 2 points. So the point is, it's not that it has to look a certain way. It's that it has to operate upon the enemy's attention, his mind, in a certain way. That's what makes it a two faces, 1 point attack. Now, a quick word on translation. Because I'm a scholar, I'm a pedant and a scholiast, and so I think more about words than is really healthy for a normal person. Conventionally, I think this is translated into English as a two sides, 1 point attack, and I don't have any quibble with that. It's just that for our purpose today at least, I want to go very far out of my way to avoid giving you the misimpression that it's this like blocky thing where we've got like the left side and the right side, that it has to look a certain way on a chalkboard. Again, I don't want to beat this thing to death, but what makes it a two-face, 1 point attack is not how it looks or how the forces are arrayed with respect to each other. It's what it does to the enemy's attention. And so I'm calling it two faces today because it seems like a sort of softer, less geometric word than sides or fronts. The Chinese word mian can mean all those things: a face, a side, a front, a direction, an aspect, a dimension. Those are all possible. Now, if this is still a little hazy to you, here's a very useful exercise. Let's talk about what it's not. Two faces, 1 point is not a synonym, for example, for a hammer and anvil attack, where we've got a base of fire with like some heavy machine guns and they just plaster the enemy position while a friendly maneuver element like goes boop, 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 and bounds up the sidelines to achieve a position of advantage from the enemy's flank where they can enfilade the enemy and make the enemy's position untenable. Two faces, 1 point is not a synonym for that. The PLA does have those kind of like hammer and anvil, base of fire, and maneuver element attacks in its repertoire. It's perfectly capable of doing those. It's very happy to do them when it has the firepower, which is not always, but they have that in their playbook, and to my knowledge, that's really sort of like a company and up kind of thing. Whereas two faces, 1 point attack, that principle scales up and down anywhere from the strategic level or anywhere from the level of whole army corps all the way down to the tiny micro level of the three-man battle small group. And in fact, I must remember to look back a little bit later and draw to your attention how already in this course we have seen a couple of examples of little tiny micro level two faces, 1 point attacks happening at the level of the three-man small group or the squad. If you were to pause now and think about the past videos and run through it, you'll know what I'm talking about. You're not going to need me to point it out to you. So, two faces, 1 point is not a synonym for hammer and anvil. It's not a synonym for double envelopment. I mean, again, the PLA loves double envelopment attacks, loves them. And in classic PLA tactics, the objective is to wage what's called a 消灭战, a war of annihilation, a battle of annihilation. That is, classically, the PLA is not fighting to dominate or take a certain position or even to force the enemy to retreat or to achieve some kind of movement in the lines. Classically, the objective of a PLA operation is to wipe out the enemy personnel, to take all the enemy chessmen off the chessboard. Now, again, that requires an asterisk because we've mentioned this before and it's common knowledge. As the Korean War passed from its first easy mobile phase when the PLA just got to do anything they wanted, and everybody was just kind of surprised and bewildered by their classic, very mobile tactics. Later in the war, as the war became more of a positional struggle, the PLA had to adapt to that, and they got quite good at doing some characteristically PLA positional warfare tricks. And those tricks were going to come in useful actually very soon, as soon as they started advising the Vietnamese for the Dien Bien Phu campaign. That's a story for another day. But gosh, we got to do that episode because the Dien Bien Phu campaign is just so interesting with Chinese advisors on one side and on the other side, my beloved French colonial and paratroop forces. That's just like your two favorite sports teams playing each other, and every play is just guaranteed to be riveting. Okay, away from Dien Bien Phu, back to Korea. So this was a tangent from a tangent. I was saying before that the objective of the classic PLA attack is to annihilate the enemy personnel to take a certain position. And I mentioned that in Korea, of course, reality dictated that the PLA had to learn to do that. And in fact, they got quite good at positional warfare. And there were people and pockets in the PLA that really wanted to keep and exploit that expertise that they developed in fortification and positional warfare for the mid 50s. That's going to be one of the big subjects of Unit 2. However, by and large, the PLA didn't leave Korea with this sort of new love for positional warfare. No, broadly speaking, for them, positional warfare was a thing that they had to do for a while in the peculiar conditions of the Korean conflict, but they really didn't see themselves doing much of that again. They didn't want to. It wasn't what they were set up for. They still remained fixated on mobile maneuver warfare because that's what they were so darn good at. In the same way, I think you could probably say that, say, the US military of 1980 certainly had lots of people who knew lots of stuff about counterinsurgency after Vietnam. But from my understanding, that did not mean that the US Army was now a deeply coin-oriented force that wanted nothing more than to study the works of Lawrence of Arabia and write early drafts of eating soup with a knife and study the French experience in Vietnam and Algeria and study the British experience in Malaysia. No, my understanding is that the US Army of 1980 had some serious coin expertise contained in it, but Big Army was still thinking of itself principally as the Reforger army that was going to defend the Fulda Gap against the Soviet armored spearheads. And that kind of remained their identity and their culture and their real interest. I may be wrong about that, in which case, tell me in the comments. The quality of the comments on this channel blows me away. It makes me such an internet optimist. Who ever thought? Okay, back to our proper business. I'm trying to give a clearer, crisper picture of what the PLA principle of two faces, one point is about by pointing out what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean a hammer and anvil attack. It's not the same as a double envelopment attack, even though the PLA is good at those things when it needs to. Also, two faces, one point is not the same as like attacking on a broad front so that you can achieve a breakthrough in one narrow sector and then flood armored spearheads through it to exploit that breakthrough. Obviously, I'm describing a favored Soviet battle plan. The principle of two faces, one point is different from that in as much as that approach, as I've just described it, is not exactly a subtle use of prestidigitation, like a stage magician doing one thing with this hand and another thing with this hand to draw the audience's attention and split it in a confusing way between these two areas while he does the real trick with, I don't know, his foot or his nose or whatever. That broad front Soviet attack that then throws the main effort behind this little Schwerpunkt and blows a little hole open through it that the Soviet armored columns run through. That's not supposed to be subtle exactly. You're going to see that thing from space. Sure, of course, the commander isn't telegraphing his intent about where he intends the main effort to come from, but this is not like a careful act of stage magic, and it's going to rely as much on muscle as it does on misdirection. In the case of Two Faces, 1 point, it could be that the 1 point attack is going to continue to be subtle. That is, we know that the classic PLA attack should begin in stealth. It should continue in stealth as long as it possibly can. And it's possible that a really good 1 point is going to continue to be subtle. Maybe the infiltrators are not even supposed to be detected, even after they're inside the enemy position, uh, doing whatever it is that they're supposed to be doing. Maybe that's taking out a command post or some kind of communications thing. Maybe it's decapitating the unit. Maybe it's working its way out the rear of the position to form a kind of blocking force so that if and when the enemy line hopefully breaks and the enemy flees toward its rear, it's going to end up running into a bunch of submachine guns that they didn't know were behind them. So the difference here is that what makes it a two-face 1 point attack is how it manipulates the enemy's attention. It's not simply about like the physical geometry of where the pressure comes and where the main effort is located. So if this isn't too confusing, you could have a PLA type attack that ended up looking, at least superficially, like a broad front attack with a main thrust at some carefully determined point.
Or like a double envelopment, or like a hammer and anvil.
It might end up looking like that on the whiteboard, but what would qualify it as a two-face 1 point attack wouldn't be how the configuration ends up looking when it's drawn on a whiteboard. It would be what is the intended psychological effect on the defenders? How does it manipulate their attention? This is also the time to point out that these numbers, two faces, 1 point, these are not written in stone. Those are just examples. Maybe you've got three faces. Conceivably, you could have four, although um, classically, Lin Biao advised against four. He said you don't want to actually try to achieve this continuous perimeter around the enemy. You don't want them to fight with the frenzy of men who are truly trapped and they know it. He wants them to at least think that they're going to be able to squirt out and escape the encirclement somewhere. Also, I haven't seen Lin Biao write this, but it occurs to me that it would take a lot of men to form a big continuous perimeter, and maybe you'd have that, maybe you wouldn't. If you're the PLA, you probably wouldn't have the firepower to make that noose really tough and muscular so that it could throw back a breakout attempt at any point. That just doesn't seem very realistic within the PLA's typical menu of resources. Friends, we'll draw this episode to a close here. We'll continue with our mini-series on the classic PLA tactics that formed the context into which the three Type 56 squad weapons fit. And then that will bring Unit 1 to a close, the unit that deals with the PLA before 1955 and the advent of what would become the Type 56 squad weapons family. This is Type 56, the story of the SKS and AK-47 in China. If you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe, and in fact, please share. We have so much more to come, and it just makes me glow with happiness to think about what we have ahead.